23 to 24. March 1945, Wesel on the Rhine. German range stakes wink in the current. Charges sit wired under the bridge piers. Machine gun arcs are penciled on laminated sector cards. The river is supposed to be a weapon-thick black decisive. Then something impossible noses out of the fog, a truck that swims. Tires kiss chop where a hull should be. A prop bites. A bilge pump chatters like a metronome. The German plan. Kill bridges, punish pontoons, choke ferries has no line item for this. The secret that breaks their water weapon isn't Allied heroics. It's an amphibious logistics machine arriving in hundreds, turning a moat into a road. For months, the Rhine has been rehearsed as certainty. Feldgendarmerie signs direct demolition teams. Primer cord is already laced through the pier galleries. MG-42s sit on sand-filled Lafette tripods. Headspace gauges still oily from inspection. An 88's traverse is chalk-marked for likely pontoon lanes. Pre-plotted artillery sits in grease pencil boxes on a fire direction board. Searchlights are masked smoke pots, staged range drums set. Doctrine is elegant: destroy spans, rake boats, let the current finish what explosives begin. It had worked before against hasty crossings on lesser rivers where Allied engineers fought water and steel at the same time. Confidence is engineered into fittings and ritual. Panther torsion bars flex in workshops. A master welder's bead on a bridge charge bracket gleams like a signature. Quality will compensate for scarcity. Craftsmanship will outthink quantity. In staff talk, the river is a multiplier, an obedient accomplice. The Americans by the book must cue assault boats, then rafts, then a Bailey inching across under timed defensive fire. Even if they scratch a bridgehead, supply will lag. The far bank will starve on the hour. That assumption, precise, tidy, comfortable, rests on one omission: the enemy may not be crossing, as boats at all, but as trucks that happen to float. The German contempt for American river work did not form in a vacuum. It was engineered at the scale of fittings, firing tables, and memory. In 1944, the Americans had shown a habit of wrestling water with men first, and steel-second assault boats knifing across engineers' bucking panels onto balks, while artillery tried to staple their shadows to the bank. In German doctrine, this was the finest kind of problem: predictable, measurable, and punishable. Mockery was a convenience, but it grew from a chart. They began with speed. American improvised ferries. The thinking went were slow-handed off from boat to boat, halted by current and bank gradient. Slowness is a target. A boat at 4 miles per hour along a pre-plotted lane lives inside an artillery bracket. You do not have to see it to hurt it. Fire direction centers had grease-penciled rectangles labeled with water speeds for different flows. The Rhine's winter and spring moods were already in the tables. If the enemy insisted on feeding the river with small craft, each craft would live long enough to be adjusted onto. They continued with fragility. An open boat is all silhouette and no forgiveness. Gunnels that kiss tracers, canvas that takes flame, men hunched over oars or clinging to rope rails that transmit shock like wire. Even the powered engineer boats, their little inboards coughing against chop, presented pleasing sums: horsepower versus current. A neat comparison that always ended with a stall somewhere in midstream, where a machine gunner could learn the names of the men he was killing. MG-42 on Lafette, at 200 rounds per minute, had an answer for planks and flesh. The answer sounded like ripping fabric and lasted as long as the belt. They added the bridges. The Americans loved their Bailey's rectangles of convenience, miracles of uniform hole spacing and high-tensile steel pins. Miracles live inside time. A Bailey grows one bay at a time. Its rhythm can be predicted, its working parties mapped by sound. The Germans rehearsed the music, let them launch boats for the first bridgehead, then drag span after span toward the far bank under timed concentrations. Drop the near approaches with 105s. Walk 150s onto the half-finished truss. A single bay destroyed is not just steel ruined, it is morale reset and clock rewound. Bridge destruction was a German language fluent and smug. They drank the propaganda too, but not as medicine, more as garnish. Americans were allegedly soft, too many sweets, too much faith in comfort, too much tail chasing, too little tooth. Supply worship creates an army that cannot improvise when the dock is gone. Thus said the old European disdain. Let them bring their Coca-Cola to the river's edge. Let them demand cranes, piers, timetables. A river favors the ascetic. That was the story told in canteens and orders groups, and stories have a way of surviving the evidence that should kill them. Finally, they measured craft against craft. The Germans knew amphibians. They had ferries, assault boats, assault bridges, and the cleverness to lash a raft out of timbers and drums. But in their catalog, the categories remained pure. Boats are boats, trucks are trucks, and when trucks touch water, they sink. Rumors of an American boat truck sounded like indigestion. On paper, such a hybrid is an insult to hydrodynamics. Tires add drag. A truck chassis raises the center of gravity. A prop tucked under a frame is vulnerable to debris and fire. A useful sentence appeared in more than one staff talk. If it floats, it dies. If it drives, it stops at the bank. So, the mockery hardened into procedure. Searchlight shutters were tested to blink a slow scan curtain across the water without silhouetting friendly banks. Smoke pots sat staged to collapse an enemy's sight picture at the moment the first assault wave committed. Then, the smoke would be cut to hand the picture back to the defenders. Range drums on 20mm and 37mm flak were set to known water widths. Gun captains rehearsed quick detachment of belts to shift fire from lane A to lane B with only 2 clicks of traverse. At company echelons, the little details were beautiful and poisonous. Spare firing pins wired to lafette legs, spare flash hiders taped to ammo cans, chalk marks on parapets indicating how many seconds a boat at current X would live in killing space Y. Everything about the American way of crossing looked obligingly episodic. Even their triumph at Remagen could be read as a single lucky fracture in the German plan, not a systematic threat. The bridge had been seized, but bridges could fall. And if bridges could fall, then what remained would be a river's natural hostility to weight. Men could cross. Supply would huff and stagger after them. A bridgehead starved is a bridgehead shortened. In this calculus, the Americans had 2 weaknesses ripe for exploitation. First, the visible ones, hulls that could be holed, pontoons that could be burned, bridge panels that could be smashed, ropeways that could be severed. Second, the invisible one-time. Make them consume hours per ton. Make every crate of 105mm shells walk instead of ride. Make wounded wait for boats already overscheduled with fuel. A river does not need to kill to win. It needs only to slow. In the notebooks of Battalion S3s and the margins of corpse fire plans, contempt became an arithmetic that looked like victory. And beneath that arithmetic, a quieter assumption no one thought to name innovation. If it came, would come in the form of more bridge, more boat, more of what the Americans already loved. No one scanning the far shore through Zeiss lenses expected the enemy to arrive in something that made their tables a joke. No one expected a logistics device to cheat a battlefield tactic. You cannot mock what you cannot imagine. The American problem at the Rhine was not how to touch the far bank. It was how to live there at scale. Assault is a minute. War is a week. Every engineer who had watched the Roer Dam releases turn a river into a schedule understood the cruelty. Water multiplied moral friction. The first platoon could cross on storm boats even under fire, even with rowing hands blistered by cold. The crisis came 12 hours later when the battalion on the far side asked for what an army always asks for: ammunition, fuel, wire, water, plasma batteries, bandages, rations hot enough to taste like a promise, and the river answered with delay. Engineers could throw a Bailey astonishingly fast, if trucks could reach the launch site, if panels could be pre-staged, if smoke behaved, if the first bays did not take a direct hit that turned neat rivet patterns into a meat saw. But a bridge is a focal point, and focal points are what enemy artillery lives for. The Americans had learned it at the Seine and the Moselle. A span in progress draws fire like a magnet. Under paper draws iron filings. A single lucky shell into a work party resets a clock by hours. A fallen panel resets it by daylight. Meanwhile, the river had appetites. Mud at the approaches swallowed axle weight. Banks that looked firm at dawn became grease by noon under traffic. Gradients mocked traction tables. A powered assault boat could shove a squad, but it could not shove a division's day. Wood rub rails chewed into splinters under repeated docking. The little inboards drank gasoline at a rate only a depot sergeant could love, and depot sergeants already hated boats because they consumed drums that trucks could have burned on roads that mattered. Logistics officers kept quiet, not because they lacked an answer, but because they knew the answer would sound like blasphemy to anyone addicted to elegance. Stop treating water as a separate domain. The supply chain could not abide transshipment points dock to boat to dock to truck, a choreography that turned every crate into a problem 3 times. Every handoff adds minutes. Minutes turn into hours. Hours become casualties counted backwards from the far bank. Casualty evacuation exposed the same wound from the opposite side. Wounded collected faster than boats could return. Litters slung across thwarts made for slow ferries. A single craft pressed into ambulance duty stole itself from ammunition, and every missing crate of 3006 or 81 mortar shells had a name attached somewhere downrange. You could mask these trades on a daily summary. You could not mask them in a company whose final attack stalled because smoke grenades ran out 12 minutes too soon. There were numbers nobody liked to read aloud. A rifle battalion in attack would eat tons per day. An armored combat command would drink fuel at a rate that made staff officers stare at ceiling canvas as if an answer were printed there. Multiply those rates by the delay penalties of water, and you did not get a war. You got a ledger of failure politely deferred. Bridgehead starvation sounded melodramatic until you plotted it against time to bridge completion under opposition and weather. What the Americans needed was not a better boat, not a faster bridge, but an exorcism of the handoff. They needed weight to depart a depot on rubber and arrive at a foxhole on rubber without ever touching a pier. They needed to make the river stop being a noun and start being a short section of road. The name for this heresy on paper could be anything: amphibious logistics carrier, river transit truck, why? In the language of mechanized armies, it meant only this continuity. Continuity has small parts. It is the driver who, without leaving his seat, bleeds tire pressure for mud, then restores it for a gravel approach with a knob on the dash. The central tire inflation that turns terrain from verdict into preference. It is the bilge pump that eats a bullet leak faster than water can threaten buoyancy, letting a craft return under its own power instead of dying in place and becoming a navigational crime scene. It is a winch on the nose that pulls a hull truck out of a soft bank without calling for a tractor that is already late to somewhere louder. Continuity is also anonymity. A boat shape on water is scandalously visible. A truck shape on water looks like a mistake to a gunner's eye, just wrong enough that he hesitates a beat and loses the bracket. A boat at a pier announces priority. A truck nosing into reeds to unload radio batteries whispers and leaves. In a night crossing with searchlights shuddering and smoke drifting, the difference between being a category and being an exception is measured in lives saved and tons delivered. Above all, continuity is multiplication. One craft that can be built by the tens of thousands beats 5 craft that cannot be built by the tens of thousands, however virtuosic the 5 may be. The American industrial answer to the river had to respect the factory more than the symposium. A truck on a boat chassis would be a boutique triumph. A boat wrapped around a truck chassis could be an order form the size of a city. Why was not just a technology? It was a promise to procurement that the last 2 miles to the far bank would not become a separate war. Operational urgency sharpened the need. The Ruhr encirclement clock was already on the wall. Every day the Rhine held its line was a day the enemy could evacuate, materiel regroup, and stiffen pockets that would cost blood to break. Weather threatened to spoil smoke. Current threatened to spoil timing. German artillery threatened to spoil the mood. Every variable multiplied delay except the one variable that could divide it, a vehicle that erased the pier. So the requirement document, whether or not it was ever typed as such, wrote itself in the negative. Not a boat, because boats create piers. Not a bridge, because bridges create focal points. Not a ferry, because ferries create queues. What remained was an obscenity against categories that, once you said it aloud, felt suddenly obvious: a truck that swims. A device so modest that staff might fail to brief it, because briefings crave drama. So decisive that the river would have to lower its voice and accept demotion to terrain feature. Call it Weapon Y if you need the glamour. The river will call it something simpler the first night it arrives, a reason why the far bank does not starve. They didn't begin with the Rhine. They began with a map that looked like a wound, beachheads with no harbors, rivers with no bridges, and front lines that crossed water more often than they crossed towns. In 1942, when the American war machine was discovering how far a factory could throw its shadow, a small circle at General Motors sat with naval architects from Sparkman and Stevens, and the problem that makes engineers grin, the kind that breaks categories. The truck was a known quantity, the GMC 2.5-ton CCKW, a patient mule with a straight 6 heartbeat, and a transfer case that could push all 6 wheels. The boat was a known quantity, a hull that displaces a prop, that bites a rudder, that mines the helm. The unholy thought was to marry them without letting either one resign. Don't make a boat that drives, one engineer kept saying. Make a truck that swims. It sounded like a prank until it didn't. Security mattered because ridicule kills projects as surely as leaks do. The Navy had seen amphibious fantasies before some clever, most fragile. So the design team worked under an anonymity of letters and shop orders, sheet metal deliveries, billed as experimental cowlings, gearboxes logged as auxiliary PTO units, hull drawings filed under innocuous revision trees. In Detroit and Elizabeth, New Jersey, the shops cut, rolled, and riveted without posters or speeches. The Office of Scientific Research and Development wrote its memos like stage whispers, enough to move steel, not enough to invite tourists. The first hull truck prototypes looked wrong from every angle, too tall for a boat, too smooth for a truck. Still, the frame took to the hull the way a key takes to a lock. Rails carried load into bulkheads. Cross members sat like ribs. The bow raked just enough to climb a beach without nosing under. The prop lived in a guarded pocket aft, driven off a power takeoff, through a marine gearbox spliced into a drivetrain that refused to choose land or water. Dual rudders answered to the steering wheel because the driver's hands would learn only one language. They launched quietly first in calm water, the way a child tries the deep end by holding the wall. The truck floated true, then pitched as the first wave slapped her chinese. A bilge pump sang. The driver laughed the nervous laugh of a man who just learned the difference between an equation and a river. By the 3rd run, they were hopping a wake. By the 5th, they were running a wet bank and clawing back onto gravel without a tow. Doubt did not vanish. It bled away. Trials cut closer to war every week. Salt found seams, sand found bearings, sticks found the prop guard. They added a nose winch because rivers like trophies. They would not let this one keep them. They added central tire inflation because a driver who has to stop to air down is a driver who dies on a slope. A dashboard knob solved a problem entire manuals had learned to ignore. They armored nothing because armor breeds vanity. Instead, they made replacement a virtue and pumps a religion. The Coast Guard men, whose superstition is simply experience, stayed skeptical until weather wrote their endorsement. A storm knocked a small boat into trouble off the East Coast during a demonstration period, and the amphibious truck, derided as a novelty, sloshed into surf to fetch the stranded. It did not look heroic. It looked like persistence. After that, signatures on acceptance forms came faster because stories travel faster than reports. Secrecy remained practical rather than ceremonial. They didn't hide the shape, too many eyeballs in too many yards for that, but they hid the meaning. A truck on a water test is a curiosity. 1,000 trucks in serial production is a campaign. The nomenclature helped D from the 1942 design year. U for utility, K for all-wheel drive, W for twin rear axles. Nothing in the letters said across the Rhine, and that was the point. By Sicily, the ducks were carting jerrycans through surf that mocked landing craft schedules. By Salerno, they were climbing beaches that sneered at gradients. By Normandy, where a continent learned that tide is a personality, they were the boring miracle that tied ship to foxhole without stopping for ceremony. Each theater wrote its own annotation to the idea until the annotation became doctrine. When docks cannot move, trucks must. If genius hid anywhere, it hid in refusing to chase elegance. The hull was thin but honest. The driveline was stock but clever. The controls were familiar, so a stateside driver could be an amphibian by noon. No one man can own a machine like that, but a few names thread the story. Naval architect Roderick Stevens, Jr., practical to the bone. Ordnance men who thought like quartermasters. Procurement officers who knew that the only secret worth guarding was a production slot. They argued about angles and access panels, about bilge capacity and bow shape, about whether a scupper should spit water like an insult. Then they built 20,000. The impossible idea did not leap. It accreted. In each trial, failure arrived as a small thing leaks around a hatch, a prop wash that pushed the stern where the driver didn't want it to tire, that refused a muddy bank at the worst possible angle. Each fix was a small thing too. Small things scaled. And somewhere between a calm bay and a black river, with machine gun fire stitching its skin, a category died. The DUKW was not a boat. It was not a truck. It was the erasure of a pause in the Allied supply chain, and that is why it stayed classified in spirit, even when the shape sat in photographs. The enemy could see it. They could not, until it was too late, understand what it removed from war waiting. If you strip the paint and the romance, the DUKW is a system of simple decisions arranged so they multiply. Start at the engine, a dependable GMC straight 6, turning a familiar clutch, and a transfer case. From that case, one branch drives axles as any truck would. Another, engaged by a lever, feeds a marine gearbox that turns a protected propeller. Nothing magical, just an insistence that the same heartbeat feed two different kinds of motion without punishing either. Steering tells the same story. The driver's wheel does not switch languages at the waterline. On land, it aims tires. In water, the same hands turn dual rudders that echo the steering linkage. The man in the seat never has to wonder which brain to use. Transition is not a drill. It is a shrug. He trucks down a ramp, feels buoyancy take the weight out of the springs, breathes once as the prop takes its bite, then keeps going. Coming out is the reverse rudders mind the line until the bow kisses mud, tires nibble at a slope, pressure bleeds down with a twist of the dashboard control, and the same machine that swam climbs. That dashboard knob is not a flourish. Central tire inflation is the quiet tyrant of the design. On sand or slick clay, a hard tire is a liar. It promises traction, it cannot deliver. Bleeding pressure spreads the footprint, lets tread bite where math says it shouldn't, and keeps the vehicle from digging itself a grave. Then on road, the same system pushes air back in so the convoy doesn't shred rubber. No pumps to fetch, no hoses under fire, no pause. A driver who can change terrain by touch is a new kind of amphibian. Bilge is the next sermon. The hull is steel gasketed at hatches sealed where frames and plates meet, but rivers are gossipers and bullets ask rude questions. The DUKW's bilge pumps are sized to make small arms leaks irrelevant to eat spray and seep faster than gravity can conspire. Water that finds its way in finds its way out. Add self-bailing scuppers and you get a climate inside the hull that stays on the helpful side of wet. The result is not invulnerability. It is indifference to the kind of damage a defender can smear across a river at range. At the nose, a power winch wears a hook-like punctuation. Soft banks and ledges exist to humiliate boats. They do not humiliate this truck. A driver angles in, lets the bow ride up, tests traction, and if the bank argues, he runs the winch to something stubborn, stakes a tree stump, an engineer's anchor, and converts embarrassment into forward motion without calling for a tractor that should be elsewhere. Multiply that 10 times an hour in darkness, and you begin to understand why focal point stopped being the correct noun for a crossing. Payload is modest by ship standards and magnificent by infantry standards, roughly a platoon's worth of men, or a comfortable 2.5 tons of what actually wins a day. Ammunition, water radio batteries, wire rations, fuel in cans that clatter like castanets when stacked. The deck is open because speed of handling beats prettiness. Gear goes in and comes out without cranes or sermons. If the mission is evacuation, litters lash along benches in seconds and casualties ride out on the same machine that minutes earlier fed mortars. Every cycle the duck accomplishes is a cycle a pontoon ferry does not have to schedule. Every cycle it accomplishes at night is a cycle the enemy can't bracket. Why couldn't the Germans just shoot them? Because they tried to shoot a category. Fire plans were built to kill boats and bridges objects with predictable silhouettes and timetables. A crossing lane becomes a killing lane when craft are few and queues are long. Ducks do not queue the same way. They launch in dribs and clusters from places that do not look like piers, moving at speeds that do not match boat tables, offering profiles that make gunners second-guess their ranging. You can still hit them, of course. You can kill anything you can see given time. The secret sauce is that the duck refuses to give you time in units large enough to matter. Detection failed first at the cognitive layer. Reconnaissance saw trucks near the water and reported trucks, not boats. Interdiction flights that looked for bridging parks and ferry concentrations found fewer of the focal headaches they trained to bonbon. On the ground, batteries with pre-plotted boxes learned that the boxes were wrong by exactly the width of an assumption that supply must pause at water. You do not update doctrine in a night, and the crossing lasted a night. Response failed next, at the industrial layer. Even had German staff grasped the device's systemic threat after a few nights, there is no counter you can build in March 1945 to erase 20,000 amphibious trucks already in the enemy's order of battle. Mines on slopes help. More 20mm on the banks helps. Mobile reserves to counterattack the far side might help. But those are answers to boats and bridgeheads, not to an artery that arrives already pumping. Mechanically, the duck's vulnerabilities are real but chosen. Armor would have sunk the concept twice, once in the water, once in the factory. Speed in water is modest, roughly a strong jog, but speed matters less than continuity. A constant trickle beats a heroic dash that cues. Seals wear, pump impellers chip, props complain about debris, differentials want grease like a religion. The design meets every complaint with stock parts and access panels that lift without cursing components. A motor pool already knows a parts chain that treats Amphibious as a variant, not a species. Now lay the system on a night crossing. Searchlights smear the sky. Smoke drifts and thins. The first wave rides in LVTs with teeth. Behind them, ducks begin their tide work. They nose in where engineers have scratched a ramp, or where a bulldozer has chewed a suggestion of one, or where no one has done anything except be brave. Loads come off by hand or by luck and gravity. The duck backs pivots with a little prop push, and a little rudder takes the current as a partner instead of a judge and vanishes into black. 10 minutes later, another arrives, then another. The far bank stops being an objective and becomes a logistics address. This finally is why the axis could not react in time. The duck collapses the crossing problem from an event into a process. Events are easy to defend. Processes are hard to even see. You can shoot a boat. You cannot shoot the idea that the last 2 miles of every supply run ignore water. You can bomb a bridge. You cannot bomb the absence of the need to wait for one. And you cannot reverse time. By the hour that German staff understood the profile they were seeing, the bridgehead was already eating and shooting on schedule. And schedule is what defeats defenders who trained to defeat courage. In the duck, there is no single miracle. There is only the refusal to pause. That is the secret sauce and engine that drives 2 mediums a wheel, that speaks to rudders without translation air, in tires that obeys terrain rather than theory pumps that turn holes into nuisances, a winch that laughs at banks and a factory that produces the whole insult by the 10,000. Technology Y is not exotic. It is worse for an enemy who worshipped elegance. It is obvious everywhere and on time. Wesel 23-24. March 1945. The Rhine is a slow animal heavy with winter, its surface stippled by drizzle and the occasional stitch of tracer that burns out before it finds a home. Operation Plunder is written across maps in thick pencil. British crossings, north at Rees and Wesel. American crossings, south artillery, like a weather system. Searchlights rake the cloud base to make artificial moonlight. Smoke pots breathe in long sighs. The river learns a new grammar: curtains and corridors, brightness and blind. Engineers move in the language of touch. Bulldozers bite the near bank into ramps. Sappers lay fascines and timber. The timber drinks black water and turns slick. Assault begins where doctrine says it must. Tracked buffaloes shoulder off the mud, their square snouts slapping chop infantry crouched behind armor plates slick with spray. The first waves go where first waves always go, into the mouth of every calculation the enemy made. Tracers comb the lanes. A forward observer counts the beats between splash and impact and talks to guns he will never see. This is familiar work. It is what the Germans expected: boats then, blood then boats again. Behind the violence, the ducks begin their shift. They don't announce themselves with the drama of a tracked hull. They nose into the water at angles under smoke that tastes like sugar and salt and something chemical. From a distance, they look like mistakes, silhouettes that can't decide if they belong on a road or a river. Drivers talk to themselves like truckers do. Gear throttle feel only now. The feel includes the way a current takes a stern and how a rudder answers a wheel. The first task is banal and absolute. Keep the assault fed while bridges are still nouns in a briefing, not objects throwing shadows. Pallets of 81mm mortar rounds ride under ponchos. Radio batteries get lashed with the same care as a child. 60mm bombs with stenciled warnings that everyone ignores for speed. Water in cans and plasma in bottles that clink a music unfit for the moment. A sergeant with a clipboard is the angriest man on the river, because nothing ruins war like paperwork, and yet his column's ammo fuel rations are the skeleton of the attack. A duck takes a wake broadside and shrugs. The bilge pump clicks its indifferent rhythm. The driver has already bled air from his tires for the bank he intends to climb on the far side. He can feel the difference in how the wheel talks back to him. He follows a strip of white tape an engineer tied to reeds. Smoke shifts and he loses it. He steers by the way the current pushes on his ideas. He slides into a cut where a buffalo's tracks have kneaded the mud into something like a ramp. Men on the bank fall into a dance they barely rehearsed. Hands, curses, rope leverage. The truck that swims becomes the truck that climbs. Loads come off and vanish into a line of figures who do not duck for tracer anymore because they stopped noticing an hour ago. Across the sector, the same small miracle repeats without applause. The ducks don't form queues that batteries can bracket. They don't sit at piers that aircraft can find. They don't behave. When a lane grows hot, a driver angles 10 yards upriver and tries again. There is no ferrymaster to argue, no timetable to injure. When a load is too precious to risk twice, the duck stays idling with a cranky rumble until the receiving unit has hands on every crate. When the engine coughs, a wrench answers. When a prop clips driftwood, a driver eases off rather than panic. It is not bravery exactly. It is fluency. German observers report boats, but the transcripts read like guesses. One notes trucks approaching the waterline in an unusual manner. Another calls them rafts with wheels. A third stops describing objects altogether and describes effects enemy supplies are arriving within minutes of the first wave. Batteries fire into lanes plotted for assault craft. Some shells find ducks and punch mean holes. The bilge pumps eat small hurts and complain about big ones. A few ducks die. They become new shoals that other drivers mark and slide past. The river learns their names without pity. As the night eddies into morning, something strange happens to time. The interval between request and arrival collapses. A company commander on the far bank discovers he can ask for more mortar rounds and get them before he finishes revising his fire plan. A medic learns that litters can leave by water without waiting for a scheduled ambulance boat. A duck that delivered ammo now takes on the wounded, and the driver makes a face at blood because it's going to be hell to wash out, and then he goes. The bridgehead expands in the shape of appetite being met. By the hour, the first Bailey components skitter across rafts toward assembly points. The ducks have already cheated the problem the bridge is meant to solve. Engineers still build because engineers build or they wither, but the sense of captivity to the span, the feeling that everyone's life is tethered to an unfinished truss, fades. Commanders plan like men who own both banks. Artillery displacements accelerate. A battalion that ought to be hungry by noon is instead merely tired. On the German maps, the crossing was supposed to be a pageant with queues they could ruin. Instead, it is a parade without a route arriving, not in massed moments, but as a continuous nuisance. When the buffaloes grind back for another lift, ducks are already returning from their third. When a platoon digs in, ducks bring more wire before the shovelers have warmed their hands. When a battery tries to time concentrations to bridge-building rhythms, ducks ignore the tune and hum their own. Trial by fire yields an unglamorous verdict. The amphibious truck is boringly good at war. Its success cannot be dramatized on a poster, but you can taste it in coffee brewed hot on an East Bank that should still be hungry. You can hear it in radios that don't die at midnight. You can feel it in the way a river ceases by increments to matter. Dawn files the night down to edges. Smoke thins and lifts. The artificial moonlight is killed with a flick. The Rhine becomes a color again instead of a mood. On the East Bank, men who have not slept in 2 days discover that their eyes can still grow wider. They expected a story, first wave, second wave, frantic bridging a bottleneck that could be punished. Instead, the river has been busy in a way that defies paragraphs. The first confession is private. A battery commander checks his pre-plotted boxes and feels a blankness where satisfaction should be. His guns performed. The intervals were correct. The splashes were generous. And yet the far bank is noisy with American ordinary mess kits clattering a line of figures carrying crates like ants a jeep snorting out of a copse field where no ferry is beached. He adjusts his glasses because that is easier than adjusting a belief. Reports pile up, and they are unhelpful. Enemy bridge activity continues is true in the way a proverb is true, but it is not an explanation for why machine gun belts are arriving in 5-minute increments to a platoon that should have spent the night conserving fire. Small craft interdicted is also true wreckage floats by a pair of men cling to a plank. A duck lies half submerged, like a judgment, and yet the line advances as if losses were rounded errors. The language of failure is careful at first. Then it goes blunt. The second confession is logistical. Ammunition expenditure on the far bank does not match the expected starvation curve. By now, according to plan, enemy mortars should have tapered to puffs. Instead, they cough steadily. Infantry rifles should be firing single, disciplined rounds. Instead, you hear the lazy bursts of men who know a resupply detail is a rumor with a schedule. The defender's own supply traces feel comic by comparison. A horse wagon catches a wheel on a stump. A fuel truck waits at a blown culvert for a bridging section that cannot be spared. A runner who was supposed to take 12 minutes takes 40 and returns with a look that says, "Don't ask." And then the ducks betray themselves not by weakness, but by ubiquity. Once you know to look, you see them everywhere, perched half on land like seals nosing under brush reversed into reeds like guilty trucks hiding from a traffic cop. A junior officer calls them boat trucks, and the name sticks for lack of a better insult. The intelligence summary that night, pale light, stale coffee, a map that smells like damp paper, finally dares a sentence. The enemy is employing a class of amphibious vehicle in quantity to maintain the crossing independent of bridging progress. Quantity. That is the indecency. A marvel encountered once is a curiosity. Encountered by the 100, it is policy. You can write a counter to a trick. You can't write a counter to a factory in March 1945. Panic arrives sideways as a new species of order. Orders shift from destroy bridges to deny ramps, and engineer squads are thrown forward to drop anti-personnel mines on likely approaches. It helps somewhere briefly. A duck takes a wound that a pump cannot out-argue, and it dies theatrically nose up a lesson in physics. But there is no pier to range, no ferry to burn repeatedly, no queue to punish with a single lucky concentration. The river traffic behaves like weather, not like a train schedule. A captain asks for more 20mm to rake the water. The answer is arithmetic, not steel. There are none to spare, and even if there were, you would be moving them toward yesterday. Counterattack plans misbehave. The reserve that should crash a tender bridgehead discovers that the bridgehead has tendons wire already strung, ammo already cached, mortar tubes already registered on the likely routes of approach. Men go forward anyway, because men do, and they die in fields stippled with new foxholes, dug by enemies who should not be rested enough to dig. The after-action note written by a survivor, with hands that will never be steady again, reads, "It was as if the Americans had been there longer than we knew. They did not pause." At Corp, someone remembers the doctrinal comfort that big rivers buy time. The phone calls are polite and acid. Why is the crossing not contained? How did they push fuel so quickly? Where are the smoke generators to blind their lanes? Answers tumble out, spent, delayed, misallocated, suppressed, and none of them survive the next sound. The throat-clearing growl of an American tank starting on the east bank, because a duck brought a fuel run no one saw. The realization, when it comes, does not arrive as a speech. It is a mood that ripples through echelons. A forward observer stops predicting when the enemy will run dry. A machine gun team stops counting their own belts against an imagined enemy scarcity and starts counting range stakes instead. A staff officer who once loved the tidy rectangles of a fire plan stares at the river and feels cheated of a theater. The Rhine was supposed to be a character. The Americans demoted it to scenery. There is horror in that banality. Men who joined a war built on ideas will steel nation find themselves undone by scheduling, by the insult of a truck in a boat repeating itself until belief dies. They had saved bridges to blow plotted boxes to fill with husbanded flak for low craft. They were not prepared to fight continuity. Artillery that can shatter a span cannot shatter a process. Air that can burn a pontoon park cannot burn an absence of queuing. Doctrine that can punish the first wave cannot punish the 10th quiet delivery of plasma. By evening, the river traffic looks like commerce. Ducks move with the stubborn patience of municipal workers who measure victory in completed lists. Somewhere a driver hangs a lucky charm from the dash, string a coin, a ribbon stolen off a crate. And in that gesture is the enemy's despair, the discovery that the god he needs to fear is boredom. Not shock, not heroics. Boredom. The dull, repeating miracle of supply that does not stop to admire itself. When the German Minister of Armaments would later confess that industry, more than any general, decides the reach of an army, he might as well have been writing an epitaph for this day. On the east bank of the Rhine, men learned in their lungs what his pages would preserve, that an opponent who can make later arrive too soon has already won. They call fire on a duck and kill it. 10 minutes later, another arrives, and with it the terrible calm of understanding. The last light shows tracks on the far bank, where trucks climbed out of water and turned toward towns whose names will be footnotes by morning. The river lies between banks, unchanged. It is still deep, still cold, still capable of swallowing a man without effort. It simply no longer matters. The power that killed it did not wear armor or a hero's face. It wore mud to the wheel arches and a grin on a driver who discovered that he could steer a rudder with a truck's wheel and climb a country with a river for a road. What Technology Y erased at the Rhine was not a distance but a doctrine. German river defense meticulous tradition, soaked correct assumed that crossings are episodes to be ruined. First wave punished bridges, bracketed ferries burned, and the far bank starved into retreat. The DUKW turned that grammar inside out. A crossing ceased to be an episode and became a process, and processes are defended not by single acts of violence, but by systemic parity, something Germany by spring 1945 could not purchase with courage. Strategically, the effect was multiplication. On the far bank, infantry fought as if roads already existed. Artillery displaced forward on time. Armor refueled on the wrong side of a rivers that still appeared on maps as a moat. Engineer battalions continued to throw bailies and heavy bridges because permanence has value, but tempo no longer waited upon permanence. The duck bridged the delta between now and finished hour after hour until the idea of a bottleneck felt old-fashioned. This tempo in tons made other plans possible. The Ruhr pocket closed faster. Local German counterattacks ran into units that were never quite short of the one thing counterattacks prey upon: ammunition at the edge. The Luftwaffe's dwindling sorties could punish a pontoon park. They could not punish a pattern that avoided parks. Course fire plans lost their leverage because their timing assumed cues that never formed. The Rhine, which should have bought time for rearrangement, instead bought the Allies' options: more axes of advance, more boldness in bridgehead expansion, and less penalty for risk. Technically, the Duck's advantage was humble, and therefore undefeatable: stock parts, familiar controls, factory scale. Operationally, it was insolent. It refused to respect water as a separate medium. Intellectually, it was lethal. It made German solutions brilliant against bridges and boats obsolete without firing a shot. In the last European campaign of the war, the amphibious truck did not replace heroism. It made heroism additive instead of compensatory. The river became scenery. The schedule became destiny. When the war machine rolls, it does not look triumphant. It looks punctual. At the Rhine, punctuality beat genius. That is why the crossing remembered in photographs as smoke and glare endures in ledgers as something quieter, a continuous line of deliveries that denied the enemy the one ally he still trusted: time. Admissions after defeat are always part truth, part alibi. Yet across German memoirs and post-war interrogations, a refrain repeats. Albert Speer, who measured strength in furnaces and man-hours, conceded that the Allies fought with a production system we could not match, a machine that turned simple designs into decisive ubiquity. Others less famous were blunter. A Corps engineer wrote that the enemy no longer needed bridges to behave like they had them, and that this changed the problem faster than our guns could. Call the lines. Paraphrase or summary if you like. The point stands, the recognition arrived too late. In March 1945, German batteries did what doctrine asked of them. Pre-plot bracket, demolish. And still watched an American logistics device repopulate the far bank, as if the river were a rumor. A staff officer asked why the bridgeheads did not starve, answered with an accountant's grim poetry. They crossed continuously. The word hurt because it reduced valor to a variable, and revealed the truth valor cannot hide, systems decide. If there is a single sentence the Axis might have wished to write earlier, it is this: don't mistake elegance for advantage. The Rhine taught that lesson by repetition. A truck that swims derided as crude solved a problem that had been worshipped as profound. A nation that built by the 10,000 could afford to be unsentimental. It could choose reliability over brilliance and still achieve an effect that felt like sorcery to those on the receiving end. In a late interview, a German artilleryman asked about the crossing laughed without humor. We were ready for bridges. He let the silence do the rest. The Americans had brought continuity instead. That was the secret, and secrets of that kind have no countermeasure in a final campaign. They only have eulogies. So the last word belongs not to a general, but to a schedule. The DUKW's contribution is not a statue's shape, but an absence, the absence of waiting at water. When rivers vanish from operations orders as obstacles and return only as coordinates, you know a war's balance has tipped. The amphibious truck did not win Europe. It removed one of Europe's oldest excuses for not losing.